Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video explores the anthropology of storytelling, the sociocultural journey of divorce in the United States. The information, historical trends, case studies, and perspectives shared throughout this series are intended strictly for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. This content does not constitute professional legal counsel, financial advice, or mental health therapy. Divorce involves intricate legal statutes, tax implications, asset distribution complexities, and profound psychological impacts that vary significantly by state jurisdiction and individual circumstances. Viewers are strongly urged to conduct their own thorough due diligence and consult with qualified professionals, such as licensed family law attorneys, certified financial divorce analysts, and registered mental health counselors, before making any decisions regarding their personal, marital, or financial status. Every single day in the United States, thousands of couples sign legal documents that officially dissolve their marriages, but the paperwork is actually the least important part of what is happening. The true disruption is not happening in a family courtroom or on a financial ledger, but inside the human mind, because human beings are entirely hardwired for narrative. For the past 50,000 years, Homo sapiens have used stories as an evolutionary survival mechanism to make sense of chaos, to organize tribes, and to pass down cultural norms. But in the modern era, the United States has inadvertently created a profound anthropological crisis. We have built a multi-billion-dollar adversarial legal system to dismantle marriages, yet we have provided absolutely zero cultural storytelling blueprints for how an individual is supposed to survive the psychological and social aftermath. When a marriage ends in America, it triggers an immediate catastrophic narrative collapse. The rigid script that society handed you since childhood, the American dream of the nuclear family, the modern mythology of a lifelong monogamous partnership, and the neatly packaged concept of a happily ever after, completely shatters into pieces. Suddenly, your past is retroactively questioned, your present is destabilized, and your future is wiped entirely blank. You are cast out of your established tribal structure, forced to navigate a profound identity vacuum with no elders to guide you, no rituals to validate your transition, and no collective mythology to help you rebuild. This initial phase is a state of total narrative bankruptcy, where the old story is dead, but the new story has not yet been written. This deep dive 10-part masterclass is designed specifically to address this hidden cultural crisis for the American audience today. This series solves the fundamental problem of identity disorientation by providing a comprehensive, step-by-step anthropological framework to understand, decode, and master the divorce journey. Over the course of these episodes, we will look at historical trends, analyze cross-cultural case studies, and examine the deep structural mechanics of human myth-making to transform a chaotic personal crisis into a structured journey of self-reconstruction. We will move beyond the superficial legal and financial logistics to examine the profound sociological phases of separation. You will discover how to identify the hidden cultural scripts that are currently causing you unnecessary guilt, shame, and grief, and you will learn the exact mechanisms required to reclaim your agency and author your own independent narrative. This is not about survival tips, it is an analytical exploration of how human beings rebuild meaning from ruins. To understand why the modern American divorce journey feels so uniquely devastating, we must first look at historical trends regarding how human societies have historically handled the union and separation of individuals. Anthropologists who study kinship systems have long noted that in traditional tribal societies, marriage was rarely an isolated contract between two romantic individuals. Instead, it was an economic, political, and social alliance between two larger tribal networks. Because the entire community had a vested stake in the stability of the union, the community also possessed highly structured, ritualized pathways for when a union could no longer function. For instance, in certain matrilinear indigenous societies of North America, such as the Hopi, a marital separation did not involve an adversarial legal battle designed to bankrupt both parties. Instead, it was governed by a simple, widely understood cultural ritual. If a marriage was no longer viable, the husband's belongings would be placed outside the door of the family home, signaling a clean, socially recognized transition. The community did not cast the individual out as a failed protagonist. Rather, the culture provided an immediate narrative slot for the individual to return to their maternal clan, maintaining their social utility, their dignity, and their tribal identity. In stark contrast, the contemporary United States has privatized the emotional burden of marriage while bureaucratizing its dissolution. Historical data points show a massive shift occurring in the late 20th century, particularly with the widespread adoption of no-fault divorce laws across various states, beginning with California in 1969. While this legal evolution provided a necessary and vital exit ramp for individuals in incompatible or unsafe unions, it simultaneously stripped away the remaining cultural rituals of transition. The modern American landscape replaced the community elder with the private attorney, and replaced the supportive tribal council with the cold, adversarial framework of family court. This shift created a massive structural mismatch. The human brain still requires a communal rite of passage to process major life transitions, but instead, the American citizen is left completely isolated, navigating a complex web of asset division, child custody schedules, and intense social stigma entirely on their own. This brings us to the core anthropological concept that explains the immense psychological weight of this transition: liminality. First conceptualized by the ethnographer Arnold van Gennep and later expanded by the anthropologist Victor Turner, liminality represents the middle stage of a rite of passage. It is the ambiguous transitional space where an individual is no longer what they were, but are not yet what they will become. In traditional cultures, a rite of passage has three distinct, mandatory phases: separation, liminality, and reincorporation. During the separation phase, you are detached from your old social status. During the liminal phase, you occupy a threshold, a state of being betwixt and between, stripped of your previous identity markers. Finally, during the reincorporation phase, you are formally welcomed back into the tribe with a brand new, celebrated social role. The profound trauma of the modern American divorce journey lies in the fact that our society traps individuals in the liminal phase indefinitely. When you separate from a spouse in the United States, you enter a prolonged, structured liminal void that can last for months or even years. You are no longer part of a coupled unit, so you no longer fit neatly into the social circles, couples dinner parties, or family dynamics that previously defined your weekends. However, because our culture lacks a formal ceremony for reincorporation, there is no public moment where your community gathers to say that your transition is complete, that your past narrative is honored, and that you are now recognized as a whole, sovereign, and fully integrated single individual. You are left to wander this narrative wasteland by yourself, frequently interpreting this structural lack of cultural support as a personal moral failure. This masterclass will systematically break down this liminal void into predictable, manageable evolutionary steps. By examining the structural functionalism of relationships and the linguistic patterns we use to describe heartbreak, we will unmask the hidden forces shaping your emotional reality. We will analyze how the modern romantic narrative became a form of secular religion in the West, placing an unsustainable burden on a single partner to be our best friend, our economic co-pilot, our passionate lover, and our primary source of existential validation. When that monumental structure collapses, the anthropological perspective allows you to see that it was not necessarily the individuals who failed, but rather the modern cultural script itself that was structurally flawed from the very beginning. Over the next 9 parts of this deep dive series, we will unpack the specific phases of this narrative reconstruction, providing you with historical context, sociological clarity, and the analytical tools necessary to successfully navigate the threshold and author a powerful, authentic next chapter. To understand how we author that next chapter, we must first dissect the anatomy of the script that just broke. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call her Sarah, living in Columbus, Ohio. Sarah is sitting in a brightly lit conference room or perhaps reviewing a digital file shared by a mediator, looking over the formal division of her marital life. On paper, the split is a collection of assets, retirement accounts, equity distributions, and a highly specific calendar mapping out alternating weekends. But as Sarah stares at these documents, the intense emotional distress she experiences cannot be explained by financial math or logistical reorganizations. The distress exists because Sarah is realizing that the cultural software she was running for the last 15 years has just suffered a catastrophic system failure. To map out how Sarah and millions of other Americans in 2026 arrived at this point of profound narrative disorientation, we have to look back at the historical trends that fundamentally altered the anthropological purpose of marriage in Western civilization. Anthropologists and family historians categorize the evolution of American marriage into 3 distinct structural eras, each placing a progressively heavier psychological burden on the individual relationship. The first era, dominating the pre-industrial period up until the mid-19th century, can be understood as the institutional marriage. In this era, marriage was primarily an economic and survival cooperative, If you were a couple living on an agrarian homestead in early America, your marriage script was dictated by environmental necessity. The husband and wife were co-managers of a localized economic production unit. The primary requirements of this script were safety, food production, shelter, and the raising of children to help sustain the homestead. Emotional compatibility, romantic passion, and deep psychological alignment were viewed as pleasant bonuses, not structural prerequisites. Case studies from this era show that when a spouse died or a separation occurred, the community responded to the immediate structural vacancy because the survival of the collective depended on filling that functional role. The emotional narrative was secondary to the institutional survival of the household. As the United States transitioned through the Industrial Revolution and entered the mid-20th century, the cultural script evolved into the second era, known as the companionate marriage. By the 1950s, the economic urgency of the family farm had largely given way to urban and suburban wage labor. Men left the home to work in factories and corporate offices, while women took on the management of the domestic sphere. This massive structural shift changed the fundamental narrative of marriage. Marriage was no longer just about basic physical survival. It became about emotional companionate satisfaction. The script now demanded that a husband and wife be compatible companions, bound together by affection, romantic love, and clearly segregated gender roles. The American dream, as broadcast through early television and print media, created a highly standardized narrative blueprint. If you followed this blueprint, you were assured a stable place in the suburban social hierarchy. However, the late 20th century witnessed another massive tectonic shift, leading directly to the era we occupy in 2026, the expressive marriage. Sociologists who track American marital dynamics note that today, the expectations placed upon a marital partner have reached an unprecedented peak. We no longer look to marriage merely for survival or even for basic companionship. Instead, the modern American script demands that a spouse serve as a primary vehicle for self-actualization, personal growth, existential validation, and identity optimization. Imagine the immense psychological weight of this modern expectation. Your partner is expected to be your passionate lover, your best friend, your co-parent, your financial co-pilot, your career confidant, your emotional therapist, and the ultimate mirror that validates your unique individual potential. In anthropological terms, marriage has been transformed from a social institution into a secular religion where the spouse is elevated to the status of a deity, responsible for granting meaning to your existence. When this expressive marriage script fails, the potential outcomes are radically different from the divorces of previous generations. When Sarah's marriage dissolves in 2026, she is not just losing an economic partner or a companion. She is experiencing what anthropologists call identity disintegration. Because she invested her entire narrative of self-actualization into that single relationship container, the destruction of the container feels like the destruction of her very self. The narrative collapse is total because the cultural script taught her that a successful life is a linear, unbroken line of marital longevity. Any deviation from that line is coded by our culture as a profound personal failure. This brings us to a critical analytical realization. The intense shame, guilt, and anxiety that characterizes the modern American divorce journey is not an inherent human emotion. Rather, it is a culturally manufactured byproduct of our specific historical trends. We have built an entire society around the myth of the hyper-individualized savior spouse. Yet we provide zero cultural training for what happens when that myth collides with the reality of human change, growth, and incompatibility. When an individual enters the legal system of divorce, they quickly discover that the adversarial nature of the family court system actively capitalizes on this narrative chaos. The legal apparatus demands that the complex, nuanced, multi-layered story of a human relationship be compressed into a binary script of winners and losers, plaintiffs and defendants, victims and perpetrators. This legal compression forces individuals to adopt highly toxic, defensive narratives just to protect their financial security and parental access. The anthropological tragedy here is that the legal system strips away the last remnants of human nuance, replacing a deeply complex transitional process with a rigid, institutionalized battle. Case studies of individuals navigating this process in 2026 reveal a predictable pattern of cognitive dissonance. On one hand, the individual is trying to process the profound grief of losing their primary existential mirror. On the other hand, they are being forced by their legal representation to view that same person through a lens of strategic hostility. This split-screen reality accelerates the narrative bankruptcy we discussed earlier, leaving the individual completely alienated from their own values and their own past. To successfully navigate this threshold, you must begin to view your situation not through the lens of a courtroom or a societal report card, but through the objective lens of an anthropologist. You must begin to see that the story you are grieving was not entirely your own. It was a script handed to you by a specific culture, at a specific point in history, designed to meet demands that may no longer serve your actual human growth. By understanding how these historical trends created the unsustainable expectations of the expressive marriage, you can begin to decouple your personal worth from the survival of the marital structure. But how exactly does one begin this process of narrative decoupling, when the daily reality of separation feels like a psychological war zone? How do you combat the linguistic traps that society, well-meaning friends, and even family members use to frame your experience as a tragedy? The language we use to describe a divorcing individual is laced with covert structural judgments that actively slow down recovery and prolong the painful liminal phase. In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive deep into the specific linguistic warfare of divorce. We will examine how the words we use secretly shape our emotional architecture, and we will reveal the precise analytical tools required to dismantle the vocabulary of shame so you can begin the active construction of your new sovereignty. Language is not merely a tool for communication. It is the fundamental framework that constructs our perceived reality. When you enter the arena of American divorce, you are immediately bombarded by a weaponized vocabulary that has been historically engineered to induce compliance through shame. Consider the very phrase we use to describe a marriage that has reached its logical conclusion: a failed marriage. Anthropologists who specialize in linguistic study how these exact labels create cognitive prisons. By calling a relationship a failure simply because it did not end in the physical death of one of the participants, our society applies a metric to marriage that we apply to almost no other human endeavor. Imagine if an American professional in 2026, let us call him Michael, a landscape architect living in Austin, Texas, spent 10 highly successful years designing public parks, winning design awards and contributing immense value to his city, before deciding to transition his career into urban planning. No one in Michael's social circle would look at his 10 years of landscape architecture and label it a failed career. It would be framed as a natural evolution, a vital building block of experience, a chapter of profound growth that served its purpose before transitioning to the next phase. Yet, when Michael and his spouse realize their paths have fundamentally diverged, and they decide to dissolve their 12-year marriage, the societal script instantly slaps the label of failure onto their shared history. Michael finds himself sitting at a cafe in downtown Austin in 2026, listening to well-meaning friends use words like broken home or shattered life. This linguistic framing forces Michael into a defensive psychological posture, making him feel as though a decade of mutual support, shared joy, and beautiful memories has been retroactively erased and rewritten as a zero-sum loss. This linguistic trap relies heavily on what academic researchers call the narrative arc of the hero's journey, but twisted into a punitive framework. In the classic American narrative, longevity is equated with morality. If something lasts long, it is good. If it ends, it is bad. This binary linguistic structure completely ignores the anthropological reality of human development. Anthropological case studies across various global cultures demonstrate that relationships can be viewed as completed cycles rather than broken continuities. To successfully navigate the modern divorce journey, you must systematically deconstruct the specific vocabulary of shame that populates the contemporary American landscape and look at the potential outcomes of shifting that vocabulary. The first linguistic structural trap is the phrase broken home. This phrase is heavily utilized in societal discourse, yet it is anthropologically absurd. A home is not a physical object made of porcelain that shatters into useless shards. A home is a dynamic network of human relationships. When a divorce occurs, the home is not broken, it is restructured. It is decentralized. By shifting the internal and external language from a broken home to a bilocal family structure, an individual changes their entire cognitive processing mechanism. Case studies in developmental psychology indicate that children who grow up in environments where parents use decentralized structural language rather than deficit-based language exhibit significantly higher levels of emotional resilience and lower rates of internalized anxiety, because their foundational security is not tied to a single geographic roof, but to the continuity of parental care. The second linguistic structural trap is the term custody battle. The legal framework in the United States deliberately employs highly militarized language. You fight for custody, you defend your parental rights, you countersue, you win placement, and you defeat the opposing party. This weaponized lexicon activates the ancient limbic system of the brain, processing an administrative and bureaucratic restructuring as an existential tribal war. Imagine the biological toll this takes on an individual. When Michael hears his legal team use the language of warfare, his brain releases cortisol and adrenaline, prepping his body for physical combat. This linguistic feedback loop prevents any possibility of collaborative restructuring and locks both parties into an escalating spiral of conflict. By actively replacing the vocabulary of combat with the language of administrative delegation, co-parenting partnership, or residential schedules, the individual exercises narrative sovereignty, refusing to let an outdated legal lexicon dictate their biological stress levels in future family relationships. The third linguistic structural trap is the label of the X, or the concept of baggage. In the lexicon of modern American socialization, past relationships are frequently referred to as baggage. This linguistic metaphor implies that your history is a heavy, useless, embarrassing weight that you are dragging through life, slowing down your future progress and complicating your desirability. From an anthropological perspective, your past relationships are not baggage. They are your personal ancestry of growth. They are the evolutionary steps that shaped your emotional intelligence, your boundaries, your self-knowledge, and your capacity for empathy. When you reframe an ex-spouse not as a villainous antagonist or a symbol of regret, but as a significant historical co-traveler who accompanied you through a specific epoch of your life, you instantly reclaim the energy that was previously being consumed by resentment. To understand the sheer scale of this linguistic influence, consider the historical trends in how the American media and legal systems have framed family units over the past several decades. Historical trends show that despite the increasing statistical normalcy of multi-household families, the dominant cultural substrate still privileges the unbroken nuclear model as the only valid baseline for human happiness and social legitimacy. When an individual divorces, they are essentially excommunicated from this dominant narrative substrate. This is where the active construction of your new sovereignty begins, executing a precise step-by-step linguistic audit of your life. Step 1 is the identification of external narratives. You must become hyper-aware of how the people around you are framing your situation. When a relative or acquaintance offers pity instead of support, using phrases that imply your life has been minimized or ruined, you must consciously reject that framing. Step 2 is the ruthless elimination of deficit language from your internal monologue. This means stopping yourself when you use terms like starting over or losing everything. You are not starting over from scratch. You are continuing with an immense, priceless library of experience, wisdom, and self-awareness. You have not lost everything. You have retained your core self, your intellect, and your capacity to design your existence. Step 3 is the creation of a personal manifesto of completion. This involves writing out the true story of your relationship, honoring its beginnings, acknowledging its growth, identifying the exact structural reasons why its closure became necessary, and mapping out the future sovereignty you are actively building. This linguistic mastery is the absolute bedrock of surviving the liminal phase, but it is only the first layer of defense. While changing your language allows you to rebuild your internal architecture, you still have to step outside your front door and face the immediate tribal network. You have to navigate the complex social crosscurrents of family dynamics, mutual friendships that are suddenly forced to choose sides, and the profound shift in how your community perceives your social value. How do you handle the hidden social alliances that quietly shift behind your back when the paperwork is filed? How do you manage the tribal banishment that frequently occurs when you no longer fit into the coupled hierarchy of your social group? In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive deep into the tribal politics of divorce, analyzing the specific social mechanics of alignment, betrayal, and community reconstruction, so you can build an unshakable, sovereign tribe of your own. To fully comprehend the tribal politics of divorce, we must look at how human groups naturally organize themselves around shared social structures. When a marriage dissolves, the cultural fallout extends far beyond the two individuals named on the legal petition. It sends a shockwave through the entire extended kinship network, fracturing friendships, neighborhood associations, and even professional alliances. Human beings are fundamentally pattern-seeking, tribal organisms that rely on social predictability to maintain a sense of safety. A married couple represents a highly stable, predictable building block within a social network. When that building block splits, it creates a vacuum of ambiguity that forces the surrounding tribe to execute complex social realignments. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call him David, a senior supply chain manager living in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina. For the past decade, David and his spouse were the foundational anchors of a tightly knit social circle, composed of 4 other married couples. They shared weekend dinners, traveled together on annual vacations, managed a shared digital calendar for their children's activities, and co-hosted neighborhood events. This social group functioned as a modern secular tribe, providing David with mutual aid, psychological validation, and a deep sense of belonging. However, the moment David and his partner announced their decision to separate in 2026, an invisible systemic transformation occurs within this tribal network. David begins to notice a subtle but devastating shift in communication. The group chat, which previously buzzed with daily jokes and spontaneous invitations, becomes strangely quiet. When David attempts to initiate a conversation, the responses are polite but brief, lacking the warmth of previous years. A few weeks later, David discovers through social media updates that the other couples gathered for a weekend gathering to which he was not invited. David has just collided with the phenomenon known in social anthropology as network purification or tribal casting out. To understand why David's closest friends are pulling away exactly when he needs social support the most, we must examine historical trends in human network dynamics and what sociologists refer to as structural holes. In any given social group, individuals are connected by varying degrees of relational proximity. When 2 people marry, their individual social networks merge into a dense, interlocking matrix of shared capital. Their friends are no longer just his friends or her friends. They are the couple's friends. This creates a profound structural vulnerability. When the marriage ends, the mutual friends are plunged into a state of severe cognitive dissonance. Anthropologists studying social balance theory note that the human brain naturally seeks harmony in its relational triads. If a friend group values both David and his spouse, but David and his spouse are now operating in opposition to one another, the triadic relationship becomes unstable. To resolve this psychological discomfort and restore equilibrium to the tribe, the surrounding members will almost always seek to eliminate the ambiguity. Potential outcomes of this structural pressure typically manifest in one of 2 ways. Either the tribe collectively takes a side, completely aligning with one spouse while ostracizing the other, or the tribe withdraws from both individuals entirely to avoid the discomfort of navigating a fractured social landscape. Furthermore, case studies in relational sociology reveal a darker, more subconscious driver behind this tribal abandonment: marital contagion anxiety. When a seemingly stable marriage within a suburban friend group collapses, it shatters the illusion of permanence for every other couple in that network. It forces the remaining couples to confront the latent vulnerabilities, compromises, and unspoken dissatisfactions within their own relationships. In anthropological terms, the divorcing individual becomes a living symbol of marital mortality. By distancing themselves from David, the remaining couples are not necessarily making a moral judgment about his character. Rather, they are performing a protective ritual. They are alienating the source of anxiety to preserve the integrity of their own marital narratives, treating divorce as if it were a socially transmissible pathogen. This tribal fracturing extracts a massive biological and psychological toll. Evolutionary anthropology demonstrates that for ancient human ancestors, exclusion from the tribe was equivalent to a physical death sentence. As a result, our brains evolved to process social rejection through the exact same neural pathways that register physical pain. When David sits in his apartment in Charlotte in 2026, looking at pictures of his friends gathering without him, his central nervous system responds as if he is experiencing a survival crisis. The feeling of betrayal is not just an emotional overreaction. It is an evolutionary alarm bell signaling that his primary support system has vanished. To survive this phase of the divorce journey and transition into true narrative sovereignty, you must execute a calculated, step-by-step strategy of community reconstruction based on clean anthropological principles. Step 1 requires a ruthless, objective social network audit. You must categorize your current relationships not based on nostalgia, but on structural independence. You must identify who among your acquaintances possesses a direct, unmediated relationship with you as an individual, versus those whose connection to you was merely a secondary extension of your marriage. Secondary extensions must be consciously released without resentment, understanding that their loyalty belongs to the marital structure, not to your individual future. Step 2 involves managing structural holes by refusing to participate in the subtribal Cold War. Individuals navigating a split frequently make the mistake of attempting to weaponize their friend groups, forcing mutual acquaintances to listen to their grievances and validate their position. This strategy almost always backfires, as it accelerates the social anxiety of the network and hastens your eventual exclusion. True sovereignty is demonstrated by completely decoupling your social interactions from the ongoing marital dispute. When you interact with remaining members of your network, your conversation should focus entirely on your current growth, your individual projects, and your independent future, thereby signaling to the tribe that you are no longer a source of relational instability. Step 3 is the intentional cultivation of a sovereign tribe. This means actively seeking out new social spaces and kinship networks that are entirely unburdened by your past marital narrative. This can be achieved by aligning yourself with communities structured around shared intrinsic values, intellectual pursuits, professional evolution, or creative endeavors. In these new spaces, you are not viewed as a fractured half of a broken couple. You are received from day one as a whole, independent, self-contained protagonist. Case studies of individuals who successfully rebuild their lives after a major separation indicate that the establishment of even 2 or 3 highly authentic, independent friendships during the liminal phase completely offsets the psychological damage of broader tribal abandonment. By shifting your perspective from personal victimhood to objective anthropological observation, you can look at the shifting alliances around you with a sense of calm clarity. You begin to realize that the dissolution of your old social circle is not a tragedy, but a necessary clearing of the ground. The old tribe was built to sustain a version of you that no longer exists. The departure of those structural relationships creates the exact space required for you to construct a brand new, resilient, and highly aligned social ecosystem that reflects your true sovereign self. But as you begin to stabilize your social landscape and map out your new tribal networks, you inevitably collide with the dense material reality of the separation. You must transition from the world of social dynamics into the tangible world of physical matter and financial infrastructure. How do you handle the profound psychological warfare that occurs when you are forced to divide the physical objects, the domestic spaces, and the economic assets that you spent years accumulating? How do you stop the division of property from becoming a proxy war for your emotional wounds? And how do you deconstruct the material architecture of your past without destroying your financial future? In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive deep into the material anthropology of divorce, analyzing the transactional psychology of asset distribution and the hidden symbolic meaning of objects, so you can master the physical transition with absolute strategic precision. Material culture defines the boundaries of human identity because the objects we accumulate are never just inert matter. They function as externalized storage units for our emotions, memories, and aspirations. When 2 people build a life together in the United States, they are not merely purchasing real estate, financing vehicles, and selecting furniture. They are actively constructing a physical monument to their shared narrative. Every item brought into the domestic space serves as a theatrical prop that reinforces the story of their unified identity. When that relationship dissolves, the process of asset distribution is rarely about the objective financial metrics. Instead, it becomes a profound anthropological crisis where individuals are forced to dismantle the physical temple of their past life, item by item, while navigating an immense psychological minefield. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call her Jessica, a software systems architect living in Denver, Colorado. Jessica is standing in the middle of her suburban home with a digital tablet, tasked by her legal counsel to create a comprehensive inventory of every physical asset contained within the household. As she walks through the living room, she stops in front of a mid-century modern oak dining table. On an objective financial spreadsheet, this table is recorded as a consumer asset with a depreciated resale value of roughly $600. But as Jessica looks at the wood, her brain does not process a financial asset. Her mind immediately retrieves a dense matrix of narrative data. The Thanksgiving dinners hosted for extended family, the collaborative work sessions during the early days of her career, and the unspoken agreement that this table would one day host their grandchildren. The intense grief Jessica experiences in this moment is triggered because the asset spreadsheet treats the table as a profane, replaceable commodity, whereas her psychological architecture treats it as a sacred relic of a defunct civilization. In anthropological terms, Jessica is experiencing the violent decoupling of meaning from matter. Case studies in consumer psychology show that human beings regularly project their sense of self onto their physical belongings. In the hyper-commercialized landscape of contemporary America, The marital home and its contents are viewed as the ultimate report card of adult success. To divide these items is to publicly admit that the narrative investment has failed, forcing both parties to negotiate over the fragments of their shattered mythology. This material transition is further complicated by the structural realities of the American legal system. In the United States, property division is governed by two distinctly different legal frameworks depending on the state jurisdiction: community property law and equitable distribution law. In community property states such as California or Texas, historical trends show a rigid approach where all assets and debts acquired during the marriage are generally split in a strict 50-50 ratio. In equitable distribution states, which constitute the majority of the country, the court looks at a wide variety of factors, including the duration of the marriage, the earning capacity of each party, and the financial contributions of each spouse, to determine what constitutes a fair, though not necessarily equal, division. The structural flaw in both systems is that they are designed to process economic capital, not emotional equity. This mismatch frequently leads to catastrophic potential outcomes during negotiations. Case studies from family law archives reveal a repetitive pattern where divorcing individuals will spend thousands of dollars in billable legal fees contesting ownership of items with negligible market value, such as a specific set of kitchen cookware, a family television, or a collection of vacation souvenirs. From an economic standpoint, this behavior appears completely irrational. However, from an anthropological perspective, it makes perfect sense. The physical object has become a proxy battlefield. Because the adversarial legal process provides no venue for an individual to seek validation for emotional betrayal or broken agreements, the parties weaponize the material inventory. They use the division of property to extract a confession of guilt, or to inflict financial punishment on the opposing party, inadvertently draining their own financial reserves in the process. To master this physical transition with absolute strategic precision, an individual must execute a deliberate, step-by-step strategy of material declassification. The first step requires transitioning from an emotional participant to an objective investigator. You must actively strip the narrative layer away from the physical matter. When looking at an asset, you must consciously repeat the exercise of defining it strictly by its structural components and its market utility. A house is not a container of broken dreams. It is a residential structure with an outstanding mortgage balance, an annual property tax liability, and a localized equity valuation. A vehicle is not a symbol of weekend road trips. It is a depreciating mechanical asset requiring insurance premiums and regular maintenance. By forcing your brain to process your environment through the lens of cold utility, you disrupt the emotional feedback loop that keeps you trapped in a state of mourning. The second step involves the implementation of the replacement cost matrix. Before allowing your legal representation to engage in a dispute over any physical asset, you must calculate the exact economic threshold of the conflict. If an attorney charges $400 an hour, and you spend 3 hours negotiating over a piece of furniture worth $1,000, you have effectively paid $1,200 to retain an asset worth less than the cost of the dispute. Sovereignty during divorce means understanding that peace of mind and financial liquidity are far more valuable than the preservation of sentimental objects. True strategic clarity allows you to walk away from physical property, recognizing that items can be replaced, but time and emotional bandwidth cannot. The third step is the systematic execution of the clean slate protocol. If you are the party remaining in the marital residence, the containment of old symbolic markers can prolong the painful liminal phase indefinitely. To rebuild your narrative sovereignty, you must completely alter the domestic geography. This does not require an expensive interior redesign. Rather, it involves the intentional removal, donation, or storage of items that are heavily coded with the past relationship script. Rearranging the remaining furniture, painting the walls, and introducing new sensory elements signals to your subconscious mind that the old structure has officially concluded, and a new sovereign epoch has begun. If you are relocating to a new space, you must view the empty environment not as a lonely void, but as a pristine canvas waiting for your independent authorial voice. By viewing the material division of divorce through an objective anthropological framework, you protect your financial future from being consumed by emotional proxy wars. You realize that your value as a human being is not tied to the preservation of a specific physical monument. The wisdom, resilience, and capacity for creation that you utilize to build that past environment still reside entirely within you. You can let the matter go because you retain the sovereign intellect that generated its value in the first place. Yet, as difficult as it is to deconstruct the material architecture of a shared life, it pale in comparison to the stakes of the next structural disruption. For many individuals, the true crisis of divorce is not the division of wood, stone, or currency, but the modification of human lineage itself. How do you rewrite the narrative of protection, guidance, and legacy when your children are suddenly caught between two separate worlds? How do you manage the deep biological anxieties of the parenting script when the nuclear family model is replaced by a complex, multi-household co-parenting system? In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive deep into the anthropology of lineage, analyzing the socio-biological mechanics of modern co-parenting, so you can protect the psychological architecture of the next generation while maintaining your sovereign authority as a leader of your family. To understand the modern reorganization of the American family, we must first look at how kinship systems operate across human history. Kinship is not a mere biological accident. It is the primary structural network through which human societies pass down resources, cultural identity, and social protection. In traditional hunter-gatherer and agrarian tribes, lineage was the absolute anchor of an individual's reality. An offspring was never seen as belonging exclusively to two isolated parents. Instead, the child was an asset, a legacy, and a responsibility of the entire clan. If a relationship between two adults dissolved or changed form, the child's place within the lineage remained completely secure because both the maternal and paternal clans maintained their structural roles. The child was not caught in a socio-political crossfire because the community architecture prevented the child's identity from being tied to a fragile, individualized romantic contract. Let us ground this historical reality in a modern scenario. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call him Marcus, a corporate data analyst living in Chicago, Illinois. It is a rainy Friday afternoon in May of 2026, and Marcus is sitting in his SUV in the parking lot of a neutral suburban public library, waiting to execute the weekly custody exchange of his 8-year-old son, Leo, and his 6-year-old daughter, Maya. On paper, this is a standard administrative transition mandated by a Cook County Family Court parenting plan, itemizing a strict 50-50 alternating week schedule. But inside Marcus's body, a profound biological alarm system is firing. As he watches his children transfer their heavy school backpacks from his vehicle to his former spouse's car, Marcus experiences a deep existential ache that feels ancient, almost visceral. He feels a temporary severance of his lineage, a disruption of his biological imperative to protect, provide for, and guide his progeny on a daily basis. This exact friction point is where millions of American parents in 2026 suffer silent, intense psychological distress. Our contemporary culture has hyper-individualized the parenting experience, stripping away the extended tribal network and leaving Marcus to navigate this dual household system in complete isolation. When the nuclear family structure fractures, the modern American script offers no cross-cultural wisdom to help Marcus understand that his lineage is not being divided, but rather expanded. Instead, the prevailing cultural background noise subtly whispers that he is now a part-time parent, a compromised protector, or a secondary figure in his children's lives. This is a false narrative created by the structural limitations of our societal model. Historical trends over the past half-century show that the United States has shifted dramatically from a default maternal custody model toward a strong emphasis on joint legal and physical custody. In the 1970s and 1980s, the dominant potential outcomes of a family court case typically involved one primary residential parent and one non-custodial parent who received alternating weekend visitation. Anthropologists studying this era noted that this system created a severe imbalance in parental investment, frequently alienating one side of the lineage while overburdening the other. By 2026, the paradigm has evolved toward shared parenting schedules, such as the 2255 model or alternating weeks. While this evolution is supported by developmental data showing that children thrive when they maintain deep, continuous access to both parental lineages, it demands an unprecedented level of emotional maturity and structural discipline from the adults involved. The historical shift has solved certain logistical imbalances, but it has intensified the psychological demands on the individual parent's narrative capacity. Let us analyze the psychological architecture of the next generation through this anthropological lens. A child's identity is constructed by synthesizing the narratives of both their maternal and paternal lineages. Children are expert observers. They possess an intuitive understanding that they are physically and genetically comprised of both parents. When a divorce occurs and the parents engage in overt or covert conflict, a dangerous socio-biological mechanism is triggered. If one parent criticizes, demonizes, or invalidates the other parent, The child does not process this merely as a dispute between two adults. The child's internal narrative software translates that criticism directly into a self-rejection. They think to themselves that if half of their origin story is bad, then half of their internal self must also be fundamentally flawed. Case studies in childhood development show that parental alienation and high-conflict transitions inflict profound damage on the child's foundational sense of security, frequently manifesting later in life as chronic relational anxiety, identity fragmentation, and an inability to trust social contracts. The child becomes a casualty of a narrative war they did not draft. To protect the next generation from this narrative trauma, you must step into your sovereign authority as a leader of your family ecosystem. This requires a systematic three-step framework designed to decouple the spousal demise from the parental continuum. Step 1 is the establishment of absolute narrative neutrality. When your children are in your care, your domestic space must become a sanctuary completely free from the toxic radiation of the previous marital dispute. This means your communication regarding the other parent must be meticulously objective, respectful, and supportive of the child's relationship with that lineage. If Leo asks why his mother has different rules or why a certain schedule changed, Marcus must resist the urge to score a narrative point. Instead, he uses neutral, validating language, explaining that both households love him deeply but manage details differently. You are not hiding reality. You are acting as an intellectual filter, protecting their developing minds from adult complexities that they are structurally unequipped to process. Step 2 involves the ritualization of the transition space. Because human beings are deeply impacted by environmental shifts, the transition day between households can cause spikes in childhood anxiety. To stabilize this process, you must construct reliable, empowering rituals around the exchange. Instead of viewing the departure of your children as a moment of lonely abandonment, you must reframe it as a planned, orderly transition of your lineage into their parallel sanctuary. Marcus stabilizes this by stopping at a favorite local diner with his children for hot chocolate before every drop-off, creating a predictable, positive sensory anchor. The rituals you build act as psychological anchors, tell the child's nervous system that they are safe, valued, and structurally secure in both worlds. Step 3 is the implementation of parallel sovereignty. One of the greatest sources of conflict in modern co-parenting is the attempt to control the environment, rules, and lifestyle of the other household. This cross-border interference is an anthropological mistake that keeps both parties locked in a perpetual boundary war over screen time limits, dietary choices, or bedtimes. True sovereignty means accepting that you have zero jurisdiction over the other parent's domestic kingdom, provided the environment is safe. You must focus your energy entirely on optimizing your own kingdom. Your home must reflect your uncompromised values, your structure, your emotional availability, and your unique family narrative. Children are highly adaptable. They are perfectly capable of understanding that different households have different cultural systems, as long as the system within your walls is predictable, loving, and clear. Let us look deeper at the long-term potential outcomes of this sovereign approach. When you shift your perspective from a broken nuclear unit to a functional dual lineage system, you completely rewrite the future trajectory of your family. Case studies of adult children of divorce who describe themselves as well-adjusted and resilient consistently point to one decisive factor: they were never forced to choose between their lineages. Their parents had the anthropological wisdom to understand that their marital contract had expired, but their parental covenant was eternal. By stepping into this elevated state of awareness, you teach your children a profound lesson about human resilience. You demonstrate to them that a crisis does not have to result in a permanent tragedy. Instead, it can be the catalyst for the orderly, dignified evolution of a human tribe. By mastering the anthropology of lineage, you ensure that the next generation moves forward with an unbroken identity, fully anchored in the strength of your sovereign leadership. But as you solidify this external structure for your children, a deeper, more intimate battle begins to brew within your own psyche. You have managed the legal paperwork, the material assets, the social networks, and the parenting schedules. Yet, when the house falls completely silent on the weeks your children are away, you are suddenly left face to face with the ultimate question of this entire transformation. Who are you when you are completely alone? How do you confront the deep psychological void of your newly reclaimed independence without falling into despair or distraction? In the next part of this masterclass, we will journey deep into the internal shadow landscape of the divorce transition, exploring the dark night of the soul and the profound psychological alchemy required to transmute absolute isolation into unshakable personal power. when the front door clicks shut and the echo of your children's footsteps fades down the hallway, or when the final mover drives away from your newly leased apartment, the silence that descends upon your life is not merely an absence of sound. It is a dense, heavy presence. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call her Elena, a senior clinical research director living in Seattle, Washington. It is a Sunday evening in November of 2026. The exhausting legal proceedings concluded 2 months ago. The asset allocation is finalized, and her children have just been dropped off at her co-parents' residence for the upcoming week. Elena stands in her kitchen. The ambient hum of the refrigerator is the only sound in the space. For the past year, her mind was occupied by tactical survival, managing legal consultations, analyzing financial spreadsheets, and maintaining emotional stability for her children. But now the external battles have temporarily ceased. Elena is forced to confront the absolute void of her own company. The silence feels hostile because it acts as a mirror, forcing her to look at a core existential question she has avoided for over a decade. Who is Elena when she is completely stripped of her identity as a wife, a daily co-living mother, and a partner? This state of acute isolation is what depth psychologists and anthropologists refer to as the dark night of the soul, or the descent into the underworld. In classical mythology and ancient tribal rituals, this phase was recognized as an essential, non-negotiable crucible for human transformation. When an individual's primary relational narrative collapses, they undergo a psychological phenomenon known as projection withdrawal. Throughout a long-term marriage, human beings unconsciously project massive portions of their own psyche onto their spouse. Your partner becomes the custodian of your safety, the keeper of your social status, the regulator of your emotional state, and the target for your unresolved childhood wounds. When that partner is suddenly excised from your daily existence, those projections snap back into your own psyche like overextended rubber bands. The resulting impact is incredibly disorienting. The pain you feel in the empty house is not just the grief of missing another human being. It is the terrifying sensation of your own repressed shadow material rising to the surface of your conscious mind. Historical trends in the United States show that the vast majority of modern individuals are completely unequipped to handle this internal confrontation. Our hyper-connected consumer culture in 2026 provides an endless buffet of immediate, pathological escape routes designed to bypass the void. Case studies in behavioral psychology highlight a predictable pattern where newly divorced individuals immediately rush to fill the silence. They immerse themselves in hyper-distraction, downloading digital dating applications within days of a separation, seeking cheap validation from strangers to patch over their fractured self-esteem. They overconsume alcohol, overextend themselves in their careers, or engage in compulsive consumer spending to drown out the internal echo. The potential outcomes of these defensive maneuvers are universally counterproductive. By fleeing the isolation, these individuals inadvertently freeze themselves in the liminal phase, carrying the unexamined shadow material of their past relationship directly into their next encounters, ensuring the repetition of the exact same relational dysfunctions. Anthropologists contrast this modern evasion with the structure of ancient indigenous vision quests, such as those practiced by various Plains tribes of North America. In those cultural frameworks, when an individual hit an evolutionary threshold or experienced a profound loss of role, they were intentionally stripped of their weapons, their comforts, and their social standing, and sent out into the wilderness to sit in absolute isolation for days on end. The tribe understood that real wisdom and unshakable personal power can only be synthesized when a human being stays still long enough to look their own internal landscape in the eye. The wilderness was not a punishment. It was the ultimate laboratory for identity reconstruction. To transmute your current isolation into a source of unshakable sovereign power, you must replicate this ancient laboratory within your modern life through a deliberate, step-by-step psychological framework. Step 1 is the sanctuary audit of silence. You must declare the quiet hours of your week as a sacred territory, rather than a vacuum of loneliness. When the silence descends, you must consciously resist the biological urge to reach for a digital device, a streaming platform, or a social distraction. Elena implements this in 2026 by setting a strict boundary. On the first night her children are away, she turns off her smartphone and sits in her living room with nothing but a notebook and her thoughts. By intentionally remaining present with the physical sensation of loneliness, you retrain your nervous system to realize that the absence of external validation is not a mortal danger. You move from a state of passive loneliness to a state of active solitude. Step 2 involves the shadow inventory and reowning process. You must systematically identify the parts of your identity that you outsource to your marriage. Write down a list of the activities, intellectual pursuits, artistic expressions, and character traits that you suppressed or traded away to maintain the marital equilibrium. Many individuals discover that they minimized their own ambition, muted their creativity, or abandoned physical disciplines to fit into the rigid script of the companionate or expressive marriage. Sovereignty requires that you systematically reclaim these discarded fragments of yourself. Elena realizes she had completely abandoned her passion for playing classical piano and her interest in long-distance trail running because her former spouse did not share or support those interests. Reowning these parts of yourself is not an act of nostalgia. It is the literal restitching of your fractured ego. Step 3 is the implementation of the sovereign self-reliance protocols. You must design and execute daily rituals that are entirely independent of any other human being's approval or participation. These protocols must be structured around physical optimization, intellectual expansion, and environmental mastery. You must cook elaborate, nutritious meals for yourself alone, treating your own body with the same reverence you would offer an honored guest. You must establish a demanding physical discipline that forces you to push past your perceived limitations, using the intense energy of your emotional grief as fuel for physical transformation. When Elena begins training for a mountain marathon in the Pacific Northwest in 2026, the grueling physical exertion acts as a form of somatic alchemy, transmuting her psychological pain into tangible physical endurance and structural self-respect. When you master the void, you achieve a state of emotional gravity. In physics, an object with immense mass exerts a powerful gravitational pull. In human anthropology, an individual who has faced their own shadow and mastered their own solitude develops an unshakable emotional gravity. They are no longer desperate for external approval, they no longer enter relationships out of a deficit-based need for survival, and they become completely immune to the weaponized shame of the surrounding culture. They look back at the broken marriage script not with anger, but with profound gratitude, recognizing that the destruction of the container was the only event powerful enough to shatter their illusions and force them to claim their true maturity. But mastering the internal void is only half the battle. Once your internal architecture is fortified and your sovereignty is secured within the walls of your quiet home, you must eventually step back out into the bright, competitive light of the public arena. You must navigate the intense macroeconomic realities of your new life, redefine your professional trajectory, and completely restructure your relationship with wealth, career, and long-term security in a rapidly shifting world. How do you reauthor your economic story when your financial baseline has been fundamentally altered? How do you leverage your newly discovered internal power to build a bulletproof financial and professional empire from the ground up? In the next part of this masterclass, we will step out of the psychological shadow and into the economic sunlight, analyzing the structural anthropology of career reinvention and financial sovereignty in post-divorce America. Economic sovereignty in post-divorce America requires a total re-engineering of the economic self. To understand how an individual successfully navigates this fiscal transition, we must examine the hidden structural math of the modern American economy. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call him Robert, a 42-year-old senior logistics director living in Atlanta, Georgia. Robert is sitting at an office desk staring at a digital spreadsheet that details his revised personal balance sheet. Over the course of a 14-year marriage, Robert's economic identity was entirely fused with a collective strategy. His financial decisions were calculated based on combined borrowing power, shared investment portfolios, tax optimization strategies designed for married filing jointly, and a single unified domestic infrastructure. The sudden decoupling of this economic machine creates an immediate structural shockwave. Robert discovers that his individual cost of living has escalated dramatically, not because his personal consumption habits have changed, but because he is now single-handedly funding a parallel infrastructure. He must maintain a separate residence, pay unshared utility bills, absorb distinct insurance premiums, and rebuild a localized capital reserve from a single income stream. This immediate friction point is what economists and sociologists refer to as the household duplication deficit. Historical trends in American macroeconomics demonstrate that the dissolution of a dual income or shared resource household results in an immediate loss of economies of scale. Data points from family economic studies indicate that a single individual transitioning from a joint household often experiences a 30 to 40% increase in per capita living expenses to maintain a baseline of material security identical to their previous standard. This is the cold material reality of structural fragmentation. In the contemporary economic landscape of 2026, where inflationary pressures and housing costs remain high, this transition can induce severe scarcity anxiety. If Robert views this shift through a purely emotional lens, he may interpret the financial tightening as a form of personal punishment or a permanent reduction of his life prospects. To counteract this psychological downward spiral, we must look at resource allocation through a structural anthropology framework. The French anthropologist Marcel Mauss deeply studied how societies utilize wealth, gifts, and contracts to create social bonds. In certain indigenous cultures, such as the Kwakwaka'wakw of the Pacific Northwest, status and societal transition were negotiated through a ritual known as the potlatch. In a potlatch ceremony, leaders would intentionally distribute, give away, or even destroy vast amounts of accumulated material wealth to signal their sovereign status, reset tribal hierarchies, and initiate new social epochs. In modern American family law, the adversarial divorce process often functions as an involuntary, highly destructive potlatch. Substantial amounts of accumulated family capital are transferred away from the core unit and distributed to institutional intermediaries, including legal firms, forensic accountants, and corporate valuation experts. To stop this structural bleeding and achieve true financial sovereignty, Robert must consciously call a halt to the emotional potlatch. He must cease viewing financial negotiations as a mechanism for extracting moral retribution and begin viewing his capital as a strategic resource required to build his future independent kingdom. This structural pivot requires the immediate execution of a step-by-step career and fiscal reinvention framework. Step 1 is the implementation of the structural firewall protocol. You must completely separate your past financial narrative from your current operational budget. This means conducting a ruthless fiscal reality audit, establishing an unshakable baseline of your individual inflows and outflows, and eliminating any remaining financial dependencies or ambiguous shared accounts that could compromise your future autonomy. Robert implements this in 2026 by itemizing his non-negotiable overhead, liquidating joint liabilities, and treating his new single-income status not as a permanent deficit, but as a clean, highly predictable baseline from which to engineer future growth. Step 2 involves the immediate mobilization and reclamation of professional assets. Historical trends show that during a long-term marriage, one or both partners frequently make implicit career compromises to maintain family equilibrium, prioritizing corporate stability or geographic continuity over aggressive professional advancement. The conclusion of the marital contract removes these structural constraints, opening up potential outcomes for rapid professional evolution. Robert must execute an emergency market value audit, identifying how his years of logistical expertise can be leveraged into higher-yielding professional tiers. In the 2026 corporate environment, this means optimizing his skill set for algorithmic supply chain architectures, seeking out senior leadership roles that require high emotional intelligence, and reclaiming his horizontal professional network. You are no longer managing a career to support a static domestic compromise. You are deploying your labor as a sovereign enterprise designed to maximize your individual equity and intellectual fulfillment. Step 3 is the transition from a mindset of defensive preservation to a strategy of offensive asset optimization. When individuals experience the wealth destruction of a divorce, their immediate survival instinct is to enter a state of extreme risk aversion, hoarding cash and viewing the economic landscape with terror. This defensive posture can severely impair long-term capital efficiency. Sovereignty means moving beyond survival mode and actively educating yourself on the structural mechanics of wealth accumulation in a single-agent economy. Case studies of individuals who successfully rebuild their net worth post-separation demonstrate that the key to rapid recovery is the systematic, automated allocation of capital into diversified, non-speculative wealth-building vehicles, combined with aggressive investments in their own professional human capital. By viewing your income not as a scarce resource to be hidden away, but as a powerful fuel to be strategically deployed, you transform your financial narrative from a story of loss into a masterclass in wealth architecture. By analyzing the economic transition of divorce through an objective anthropological lens, you strip away the layers of societal shame that frequently paralyze the newly single professional. You begin to see that the restructuring of your finances is not a sign of failure, but a predictable, manageable phase of systemic reorganization. The wealth you accumulated during your previous chapter was not an accident. It was the direct product of your intellect, your labor, and your strategic capability. Because those core generating assets reside entirely within your own mind, your capacity to build, optimize, and dominate your economic future remains completely uncompromised. Robert is no longer a victim of household duplication. He is the chief executive officer of his own sovereign future. But as you fortify your financial empire, stabilize your professional trajectory, and secure your individual material safety, you inevitably lift your eyes to look back at the social horizon. You have mastered your language, your tribe, your assets, your lineage, your solitude, and your capital. You are now standing as a completely integrated, highly sovereign individual in the modern world. Naturally, you face the final, most complex anthropological frontier, the world of modern human connection. How do you re-enter the contemporary romantic marketplace without repeating the exact structural errors of your past? How do you navigate the highly fragmented, technologically mediated dating architecture of 2026 while preserving your hard-won autonomy? In the next part of this masterclass, we will step onto the modern cultural battlefield of intimacy, analyzing the evolutionary anthropology of attraction, boundaries, and sovereign relationship design, so you can navigate future connections with absolute strategic clarity. Stepping onto the modern cultural battlefield of intimacy means confronting an environment that has undergone a profound technological mutation. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call her Amanda, a 41-year-old corporate communications vice president living in San Diego, California. Amanda is sitting on her sofa on a quiet Tuesday evening in 2026, holding her smartphone, looking at the glowing interface of a modern dating application that she recently downloaded. 2 years after the formal conclusion of her 12-year marriage, her internal architecture is stable, her finances are sovereign, and her co-parenting routine is predictable. Yet, as she scrolls through an endless array of digital profiles, she experiences a distinct sensation of cognitive friction. The system she is interacting with does not resemble any historical model of human courtship. It is a gamified, hypercommodified marketplace driven by predictive algorithms, optimized user metrics, and frictionless behavioral feedback loops. For a post-divorce individual in 2026, entering this digital arena without a rigorous anthropological framework can lead to immediate psychological disorientation, as the modern dating apparatus is designed to maximize platform engagement rather than facilitate authentic human integration. To understand the hidden mechanics of this digital landscape, we must look at historical trends in how human societies regulated attraction and pair bonding. For the vast majority of human history, courtship was embedded within a dense matrix of tribal supervision. Mate selection was not an isolated individual choice. It was a communal process heavily mediated by extended kinship networks, shared geographical spaces, and collective values. This structural embedding provided a high level of narrative transparency. You knew the family lineage, the societal reputation, and the behavioral history of a potential partner before you ever engaged in intimate communication. The collective tribe acted as a protective filter, insulating the individual from predatory behavior and ensuring that relationship formation aligned with the long-term survival of the group. In 2026, this ancient protective framework has been completely dismantled and replaced by the hyper-individualized digital interface. The modern dating app strips away all contextual tribal data, reducing the immense complexity of an individual's genetic history, emotional intelligence, and character architecture into a few curated photographs and a brief text block. Anthropologists studying digital mating behaviors note that this abstraction triggers a psychological phenomenon known as choice saturation or the paradox of choice. When the human brain is presented with an illusion of infinite mating options, it defaults to a consumerist mindset, treating potential human partners as disposable commodities. This creates a state of perpetual relationship instability, where individuals are constantly scanning the horizon for a superior optimization, completely undermining the capacity for deep emotional investment and patient narrative construction. Case studies of post-divorce individuals re-entering the dating market in 2026 reveal a highly predictable pattern of behavioral vulnerabilities. There are two primary maladaptive scripts that individuals frequently execute when recovering from a narrative collapse. The first script is the reactionary clone search, where the individual subconsciously seeks out a partner who represents an exact structural duplicate of their former spouse, attempting to retroactively fix the broken pieces of their past marriage through a new actor. The second script is the hyper-independent shield, where the individual engages exclusively in superficial, short-term connections, using casual intimacy as a mechanism to avoid the vulnerability required to build a meaningful partnership. The potential outcomes of both strategies are structurally identical. They prolong the painful liminal phase and insulate the individual from true emotional evolution, trapping them in a feedback loop of repeating trauma patterns. To navigate this cultural battlefield with absolute strategic clarity, you must reject the automated scripts of the modern marketplace and adopt the methodology of sovereign relationship design. This is a deliberate, analytical framework that empowers you to author bespoke connection models that serve your personal growth without compromising your hard-won autonomy. The implementation of this design requires a strict, step-by-step operational protocol. Step 1 is the implementation of the core values audit. Before you expose your psyche to the external currents of the dating marketplace, you must construct a definitive, non-negotiable inventory of your core existential values and lifestyle boundaries. This inventory must be completely insulated from the influence of societal expectations or romantic infatuation. You must clearly define your relationship to your time, your space, your capital, and your lineage. For Amanda, this means recognizing that her professional ambitions, her physical training schedules, and her dedicated weeks with her children are sovereign territories that cannot be compromised or reorganized to accommodate the spontaneous demands of a new partner. By establishing these hard parameters prior to engagement, you create a powerful cognitive filter that instantly eliminates low-alignment connections. Step 2 involves the deconstruction of the relationship escalator. Contemporary Western culture promotes a highly standardized romantic script, known by sociologists as the relationship escalator. This script dictates that any valid romantic connection must move through a linear sequence of progressive milestones: casual dating, exclusive monogamy, cohabitation, formal engagement, marriage, and the merging of legal and financial assets. The anthropological mistake made by most post-divorce individuals is assuming that this escalator is the only path to legitimate intimacy. Sovereign relationship design allows you to completely decouple connection from the escalator. You can intentionally design a relationship that functions beautifully in a specific container, such as a committed partnership where both individuals maintain entirely separate residences, distinct financial architectures, and independent social networks. By refusing to let an outdated cultural blueprint dictate the trajectory of your intimacy, you protect your sovereign kingdom from structural overextension. Step 3 is the execution of strict emotional pacing and chemical regulation. When a human being experiences attraction, the brain releases a dense cocktail of neurotransmitters, including dopamine, oxytocin, and phenethylamine. This biochemical surge can temporarily hijack the prefrontal cortex, blinding the individual to severe red flags, value misalignments, and behavioral inconsistencies. For an individual who has previously experienced a marital collapse, this chemical infatuation can be highly dangerous, as it mimics the sensation of deep safety while masking latent dysfunction. To master this biological mechanism, you must enforce a strict protocol of emotional pacing. This means deliberately restricting the frequency of communication and interaction during the initial phases of courtship, forcing your relationship to develop at a speed that allows your analytical intellect to continuously evaluate the other person's consistent behavioral data over time. You vet the character through months of observing cross-situational behavior, rather than surrendering your sovereignty to an immediate chemical rush. Furthermore, a major component of step-by-step sovereign relationship design is the ironclad insulation of your lineage. Post-divorce parents frequently make the mistake of introducing casual romantic partners to their children too early in the relationship arc, seeking validation or attempting to rapidly reconstruct a simulated nuclear family model. This behavior exposes the children to secondary cycles of attachment and loss, destabilizing their developing psychological frameworks. Sovereign relationship design mandates a strict firewall between your adult dating life and your parental ecosystem. A new partner should only gain access to your children after an extensive, multi-month vetting process has proven that the relationship is stable, deeply aligned, and built on an unshakable foundation of shared values. By maintaining this boundary, you preserve the sanctuary status of your household and reinforce your children's understanding that your commitment to their lineage is absolute and uncompromised by your personal pursuit of intimacy. Through the rigorous application of these anthropological principles, the modern dating battlefield transforms from a source of anxiety into a landscape of profound opportunity. You no longer view the digital apps or the shifting cultural dynamics as a threat to your stability. Instead, you see them as a vast laboratory where you can observe human behavior, practice your boundary enforcement, and selectively engage with connection on your own terms. You have successfully decoded the hidden software of human attraction, dismantled the vocabulary of shame, restructured your tribe, secured your wealth, and protected your legacy. You are now standing at the absolute apex of your personal evolution, ready to synthesize every single insight from this journey into a permanent philosophy of life. But how do we bind all these separate pillars of sovereignty together into an unbreakable, cohesive worldview? How do you take the pain of the initial narrative collapse, the confusion of the liminal void, the strategic triumph of financial and parental restructuring, and forge them into the ultimate identity archetype, the sovereign storyteller? In the 10th and final part of this masterclass series, we will unveil the grand synthesis of the entire divorce journey. We will map out the precise psychological blueprints required to permanently integrate your past into a legacy of unshakable internal power, revealing the final evolutionary step that transforms a personal crisis into your greatest cultural masterpiece. To achieve this masterwork of self-reconstruction, you must step into the final anthropological phase of the rite of passage, reincorporation. This is the moment where you officially exit the liminal void and re-enter your social world, not as a broken survivor of a dissolved contract, but as a fully integrated sovereign agent. Imagine an American professional in 2026. Let us call him Thomas, a 45-year-old architectural engineer living in Boston, Massachusetts. It is a crisp Saturday evening in December of 2026, and Thomas is standing in his newly designed urban loft, preparing to host an end-of-year gathering for his colleagues, his expanded tribal network, and his teenage children. If you had observed Thomas 2 years ago, during the initial explosion of his divorce, you would have witnessed a man suffering from complete narrative bankruptcy. His past felt like a fabricated illusion, his present was a chaotic web of adversarial legal documents, and his future was a terrifying blank canvas. But today, as he watches his children comfortably arrange the space, Thomas is executing the ultimate act of narrative integration. He has not erased the 14 years of his marriage, nor has he locked them away in a dark vault of shame. Instead, he has woven that entire historical epic into the broader fabric of his life story, viewing it as a demanding, essential graduate-level crucible that prepared him for the monumental authority and clarity he now wields. This is the permanent transition from the reactive scripts that trap individuals in perpetual suffering to the supreme archetype of the sovereign storyteller. In the immediate aftermath of a relational collapse, the human mind naturally defaults to one of two primitive narrative configurations: the victim or the avenger. The victim archetype structures the personal history around powerlessness, framing the former spouse as an omnipotent oppressor and the self as a permanent casualty of broken expectations. The avenger archetype structures the story around retributive justice, dedicating immense cognitive energy to punishment, score settling, and the continuous public validation of one's own moral superiority. Case studies in clinical sociology demonstrate that both the victim and the avenger scripts are developmental dead ends. They keep the individual biologically and psychologically tethered to the dead relationship container, continuously draining their creative focus, their vital health, and their financial capital. The sovereign storyteller, however, completely transcends this binary trap. The sovereign storyteller recognizes that while they could not control the structural collapse of the old contract, they possess absolute, uncompromised authorship over the meaning of the event. They rewrite the disaster not as a tragic conclusion, but as a severe alignment correction, an evolutionary necessity designed to shatter an unsustainable compromise and unlock a higher iteration of human potential. Historically, when an initiate completed a grueling rite of passage in traditional tribal societies, their return to the community was marked by a definitive, public transformation. They did not slip back into the village hoping no one would notice their change of status. They returned wearing new cultural garments, bearing new names, and carrying unique wisdom synthesized during their isolation in the wilderness. Because the contemporary United States lacks this public ceremony of reincorporation, you must perform the ritual behaviorally. You do this by deliberately displaying your new identity markers to your social and professional networks. You speak of your past marriage with absolute neutrality, dignity, and respect, demonstrating to your tribe that the conflict has been entirely digested and converted into internal wisdom. When Thomas interacts with his social circle in Boston in 2026, there is zero residue of bitterness, zero passive-aggressive commentary, and zero demand for emotional sympathy. His complete psychological equilibrium signals to his network that he is a centered anchor point, which instantly elevates his social value and consolidates his professional authority. To permanently cement this state of sovereign integration within your own life, you must execute the final three-step narrative coding protocol. Step 1 is the definitive closure of the historical ledger. You must conduct a private mental audit and formally cancel all outstanding emotional debts. This means releasing the expectation of an apology, a confession of guilt, or a retroactive validation from your former spouse. You accept that the ledger is permanently balanced by the invaluable self-knowledge and boundary strength you extracted from the experience. Step 2 is the construction of your multi-generational legacy script. You must project your vision 10, 20, and 30 years into the future, anchoring your daily decisions in the building of an independent empire of wealth, health, intellect, and family leadership. You are no longer navigating a temporary crisis. You are building an unshakable monument of resilience for your lineage to inherit. Step 3 is the manifestation of the authorial voice. You take complete command of your daily routine, your physical optimization, and your creative output, ensuring that every single hour of your life reflects your uncompromised personal vision. Let us analyze the profound historical trends that emerge when an entire segment of a population shifts from a framework of marital failure to narrative sovereignty. Sociological case studies indicate that when individuals successfully navigate post-separation liminality through intentional narrative reconstruction, their potential outcomes include an unprecedented spike in entrepreneurial activity, artistic production, and community leadership. The energy that was previously consumed by the preservation of a mismatched marital structure is liberated and redirected into the public sphere. These sovereign individuals become the primary architects of modern cultural evolution. They demonstrate to a hyperfragile society that human beings are not brittle porcelain objects that shatter permanently under pressure, but are rather anti-fragile, complex organisms that require structural shocks to achieve their highest forms of development. Your divorce was not a detour from your destiny. It was the violent stripping away of a limiting script so that you could finally step onto the main stage of your life as the absolute author of your existence. But as you lock in this ultimate state of personal mastery and establish your unshakable sovereign foundation, you realize that the reconstruction of the self is merely the baseline phase of a much larger global reality. You have mastered the internal landscape of the individual journey, but you are still operating within an outer world that is undergoing massive systemic, economic, and technological upheavals. The true test of your newly forged sovereignty lies in how you deploy this power across the broader arenas of macroeconomic disruption, legacy asset accumulation, and the engineering of multi-generational influence in an unpredictable future. How do you take this bulletproof psychological architecture and use it to navigate the impending waves of global financial restructuring, technological acceleration, and institutional shift? How do you scale your individual sovereignty into an impregnable, multi-generational empire that protects your lineage for centuries to come? In our upcoming, highly anticipated deep dive masterclass series titled Sovereign Empire, Advanced Strategies for Macroeconomic Resilience and Legacy Engineering, we will transition from the internal alchemy of identity to the external mechanics of absolute systemic domination, mapping out the precise blueprints required to turn your personal liberation into a permanent historical legacy.